Starting off at number 10 with the creation story. God created the world in 7 days. He created the plants and the animals and human beings. And the first man he created was Adam and his wife, whose name was Eve. God had also given them one simple rule to obey. They were not allowed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if they ate from the tree, they would lose their lives. So Eve was tempted by a serpent, and the common belief was that the serpent was actually the devil disguised as a serpent, and another belief is that the devil actually possessed a serpent and controlled it to tempt Eve. Either way, the temptation was to eat of the fruit of the forbidden tree, and she gave Adam some of the fruit to eat also. So their physical death was not immediate, but their relationship with God changed completely forever, and they were kicked out of their home, which was the Garden of Eden. The story at number 9 is Noah and the Ark. Because people became so corrupt and evil, they listened to that serpent a little too much, God chose to destroy the entire world with a flood. So God chose a man by the name of Noah to be his prophet, and for more than 100 years, Noah and his sons, they built a large boat known as the Ark, and it was big enough for many of the animals on the planet, as well as it was also big enough to fit anyone else who wanted to come on board. However, in the end, only Noah and his family and the animals were on the boat when the flood began. It rained for 40 days and nights, and after the flood, God created a rainbow in the sky as a promise that he would never ever destroy the earth again with a flood. The story at number 8 brings us the Battle of Jericho. After the great leader and prophet Moses had passed away, the ancient Israelites, they were led by a man by the name of Joshua, and his mission was to take the Israelites into the promised land. And their first challenge, though, was to conquer the city of Jericho. This was pretty difficult because the city was surrounded by a massive and heavily fortified wall, and God told Joshua that they would conquer the city, but it had to be done in a certain way. They were to take the city by walking around it. They walked around the city of Jericho once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, they walked around the entire city 7 times. But after that, they blew their trumpets and they shouted, and the walls came crumbling down miraculously. David and Goliath come in at number 7. David was very young at this time, perhaps in his teenage years, and he slew the Philistine giant named Goliath. What was happening was that the nation of Israel, they were at war with the Philistines, and their progress was halted, and the Philistines put so much terror in the hearts of the Israelites, all because they had this massive giant person named Goliath on their side. So everybody was afraid of him. Now, David, he was sent to the battlefield to bring some supplies to his brothers. He wasn't even in the Israelite army himself, but he heard Goliath cursing the God of the Israelites. So David got pretty upset and he volunteered to fight Goliath, to everybody's surprise. He took up a sling with some stones and he launched a stone into Goliath's head, and it literally knocked the life out of him. And because of that story, it's often used in pop culture, the example of David and Goliath, when an unlikely person accomplishes a great task. Next up, we have the story of the fiery furnace. There are these 3 young Israelite men who were taken as captives and were given the Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they, along with Daniel, who was renamed Belteshazzar, became high-ranking men in Babylon. Now, the king of Babylon had created a huge statue, and he passed a law that said that anyone who did not bow down and worship the statue would be thrown in the furnace of fire. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were Israelites. They refused to bow down to the statue. That would be breaking their commandment. They only worshiped the true living God. As a result, though, they were put into the fiery furnace, and it was set 7 times hotter than normal. However, they didn't burn up. The people actually throwing them in there were the ones that burnt up. And the Bible says that they actually survived. They were walking around in the fiery furnace, and an appearance of a 4th person showed up inside of the fiery furnace with them. Number 5 brings us Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel was taken as a captive when he was young, along with the men that I just mentioned, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But when Daniel was an old man at this time, there was another group of powerful men that wanted him out of the way so that they can take his position. Daniel had a lot of influence on the king, but they didn't like that. They wanted to be the ones that had that major influence. So these group of men, they ended up convincing the king, who happened to like Daniel a lot, to pass a law that said that those who were caught worshiping anyone or anything other than the king would be thrown into the den of lions. So the king signed this in haste. He wasn't even thinking about his close friend Daniel. And of course, Daniel was caught praying to God, so he was thrown in the lion's den. The next day, the king actually went to go check and called out and said, "Daniel, are you alive? Did your God save you?" Daniel was alive. And the king actually got the men that plotted against Daniel to be thrown in the lion's den instead. The story at number 4 is Jonah and the fish. Jonah was a prophet of God who was told to go to a city known as Nineveh to preach to them. And Jonah didn't like the people of Nineveh, so he decided to, go in a different direction. He was like, sorry God, I'm not talking to those people. So he got on a boat, and there was a massive storm that happened, and it was so bad that the sailors on that boat were like, okay, somebody angered the gods or something. And Jonah was like, well, I guess it's my fault that all of this is happening. The storm is so bad, so throw me overboard. So they did that. And while he was in the water, he was swallowed up by a huge fish. And this is commonly referred to as a whale, but it's not specified what type of fish in the Bible. Either way, he was in the fish's belly for 3 days and nights. And he prayed to God and said that he would go to Nineveh to preach. So the whale ended up spitting Jonah on dry land, and he finally went to Nineveh to preach to the people. And to his surprise, the people repented. They accepted God's message, and God spared them from destruction. And Jonah was very angry at this. He was like, what? They're not getting punished? What's really happening here? I don't like them. Number 3 brings us the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people. Now, this and similar stories are mentioned in multiple places in the New Testament of the Bible. There was a crowd of people that followed Jesus as he taught them. And after some time, they got really hungry, and he had asked his disciples where they would be able to get enough food to feed everybody. And Jesus asked this question to get them to think about the miracle that he was about to perform. So what happened was that the disciples, they went around, they asked people if they can bring what food they have, and they ended up bringing back 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus. And what did Jesus do? He ended up feeding everybody with this. So much so that they had 12 baskets left for Jesus and his disciples to eat afterwards. The number 2 most popular story is the birth of Jesus. There was an angel that appeared to Mary and told her that she would have a son. Not only was Mary told that she would have a son, but that the son would be the Redeemer. But she never had any intimate relations with a man, so it was kind of confusing to her. How could she get pregnant with the Messiah? And the angel told her that the baby was placed into her by the power of the Holy Spirit. And nowadays, many Christians celebrate the birth of Christ at Christmas time. And finally, we end this episode off with the story at number 1, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. In the days before the crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem, and people were cheering and worshiping him. And it seemed hard to believe that those same people were actually yelling for him to be crucified shortly after. After he was nailed to the cross and buried, Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And now Christians remember the resurrection of Jesus with the celebration of Easter every single year.
All right, starting off at number 10, we've got to look at the story of Adam and Eve. God created the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve. In the middle of the garden, there was a single tree with fruit that was forbidden to them. Now, thanks to the crafty serpent, aka Satan, Eve and Adam were tricked into ignoring God's command. One of the consequences they faced was that they became instantly aware of their own nakedness. Imagine how uncomfortable you would feel if, after having lived in oblivious nudity without any feelings of shame, you took a bite of a contraband fruit and suddenly realized, like, oh crap, I'm naked and completely vulnerable to this other person. Meanwhile, with a growing feeling of shame about your own body, which was now exposed. Up next, we have the story of the talking donkey. King Balak of the Moabites worried about Israel's military advantage and requested Balaam's service, which basically consisted mainly of blessing and or cursing people depending on God's instructions. Balaam saddled up his donkey and hit the road toward the Moabite king. However, God became angry with Balaam for going and sent an angel with a sword to block his path. Upon seeing the angel, the donkey stopped immediately, but for some reason, Balaam couldn't see the angel and began beating the frightened donkey to keep it moving. That was until finally the donkey miraculously spoke words and told Balaam off. Balaam became even more embarrassed and repentant when the angel informed him that if it were not for the donkey who stopped upon seeing him, Balaam would not be alive at this moment. All right, this next one is just cringe, 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 even from the title, 100 foreskins. Before David became Israel's king, he had to put up with a rather jealous King Saul who hated him, especially after discovering that his daughter Michal was in love with David. Saul declared that if he wanted to marry Michal, David would need to bring him the foreskins of 100 Philistine enemy soldiers. King Saul did not expect David to survive, so when David returned with 200 foreskins, Saul was shocked and had to hand over his daughter. Now for me, how cringy is it though that the value of his daughter's hand in marriage was set at 100 foreskins? Just like, ew. And up next, we have the story of naked Noah. One night, after having too much to drink, Noah passed out drunk and completely naked in his tent. While unconscious, his son Ham walked in on him naked. So instead of honoring his father by covering him up, he went and joked about it to his brothers Shem and Japheth. They immediately walked backwards into Noah's tent to cover him up without observing his nakedness. Now, it must have been pretty embarrassing as a father to wake up and hear stories about your son having walked in on you completely naked, and then instead of respectfully covering you, joking about it to everyone else. Up at number 6, we have a story about forced honoring. As a high-ranking official, Haman was offended when a Jew named Mordecai refused to bow to him. To get revenge, Haman tried to convince the king to let him issue a decree that would legalize the termination of all Jews throughout the kingdom. I feel like that's quite a severe overreaction. What Haman didn't realize was that the Queen Esther happened to be a Jew, as well as Mordecai's cousin. In addition, Mordecai was directly responsible for exposing a plot to assassinate the king, so the king wanted to honor him. The king went to Haman for advice about how to honor a man who had pleased the king. Haman, stupidly assuming that he was the one to be honored, came up with a wonderful plan. The king loved the plan so much that he ordered Haman to carry it out, but in honor of Mordecai. Thus, an embarrassed Haman was forced to lead Mordecai, the man he despised, dressed in royal robes and mounted on a royal horse, through the city streets, announcing to everyone that the king approved of Mordecai. And at the halfway point in today's video, we have the story of Jesus' betrayer. Judas is famous for accepting payment to lead Jesus into enemy hands. Shockingly, his plot was brought to light by Jesus himself. After announcing to his disciples that a traitor was in their midst, Jesus exposed Judas's secret plans by stating that the one he hands a piece of bread to would betray him. Imagine how awkward Judas must have felt accepting the piece of bread from Jesus. Surprised by the whole situation, Judas left to, of course, fulfill the plan as Jesus said he would. Even more cringy, though, was the fact that Judas had the nerve to greet Jesus with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane just as he was betraying him. And moving on to God and Abram. When the Lord appeared to the 99-year-old Abram, he laid out the rules for confirming the covenant between them. In exchange for being the father of many nations, inheriting the land of Canaan, and becoming fruitful, Abram needed to do a couple of things. Number 1, he had to walk blamelessly before the Lord. Number 2, he had to change his name to Abraham instead of Abram. And number 3, this is the kicker, he had to cut off his foreskin. Now, I'm sure that Abram probably wasn't shocked by the idea of changing his name or living an honest life, but undergoing a circumcision, that must have seemed like a pretty random request, not to mention how awkward it must have been for him to do at the age of 99. And up at number 3, we have the story of the unfaithful woman. The prophet Hosea must have been shocked when God instructed him to marry a prostitute. And oh, by the way, she's going to cheat on you too. Can you imagine how cringy it must have been to stand there and have to marry a street worker who you already knew was going to cheat on you? But he did it. And just as God said, after bearing 3 children to Hosea, his wife took another lover. In order to show how devoted he was to the people of Israel, God ordered Hosea to show unconditional love to his wife by buying her back from the man she'd been sleeping with. In a way, this is a story of forgiveness, but at the same time, it would also be pretty awkward paying someone to give you back your own wife. Our next story is that of deceiving Jacob. Laban had 2 daughters named Leah and Rachel. Rachel's beauty captivated his nephew Jacob. Now, in order to win Rachel as his wife, Jacob promised to become Laban's employee, or basically a slave, for 7 years. But when the wedding day finally arrived, the devious Laban, in an attempt to marry off his oldest daughter first, dressed up Leah as Jacob's bride instead of Rachel. So you must be wondering, how did he not notice? Well, the veiled wedding outfit combined with the darkness of the marriage chamber prevented Jacob from noticing a problem until the next morning. Now, how cringy would it be to wake up thinking you're lying next to the love of your life, who you slaved away for 7 years, only to find out that you had been tricked? Even more insane is that Jacob worked another 7 years for Laban just to finally be able to marry Rachel as well. Now, man, that is commitment and love. All right, and all the way down to number 1, we have the story of Lot's daughters. This is probably the most cringy to me. All right, so after fleeing from the smoldering wasteland that had been Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters settled in a deserted mountainous region. His 2 daughters, believing that most of the world had been destroyed by fire and brimstone, concluded that in order for them to preserve their family line, they would have to get their father drunk and then, well, spend the night with him. I know. So for 2 consecutive nights, 1 night for each daughter, they managed to get their father so completely smashed that he apparently wasn't aware of what was happening. Now, what I'm wondering, would this situation have been more awkward for the daughters or for Lot, especially when he realized what had happened and that both daughters were pregnant with his children? I mean, it's like, hey children, meet your father, also your grandfather. Major cringe factor here, my friends.
So let's start off this episode at number 10, the different genealogies of Jesus. So it was said that the Messiah had to be of the line of King David, and it's found in various Old Testament books of the Bible, like Jeremiah and Isaiah. So the 2 Gospels in the New Testament, they provide genealogies of Jesus to validate this requirement. Now, in the book of Matthew chapter 1 verses 16, that passage goes as follows. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Now, the other genealogy in the book of Luke chapter 3 verses 23, it goes backwards and it begins as follows. Jesus was a son, so it was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli. Now, the most common response to this is to say that the genealogy in Luke was for Mary, but that's not what the text says. It says that it's for Joseph. So was Joseph's father Jacob or Heli? Number 9 is, what did these women actually do at the tomb? So there are some women that discovered the empty tomb of Jesus and they returned to tell others. This is recorded in the book of Matthew 28 verses 8, and it says, "The women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples." Now, this is also corroborated in the book of Luke 24 verse 9 that goes, "When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the others." But Mark's account has a different outcome. It says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's found in Mark 16 verses 8. That's actually how the original version of the Gospel of Mark ended that verse, but later on an addition was made that extends the verse, and it made the verse fall more in line with the accounts of Matthew and Luke. So depending on the Bible, it may read a little bit differently. All right, moving on to number 8. No one can see God. Yeah, that's mentioned in 1 John 4 verses 12. No one has ever seen God. And also 1 Timothy chapter 6 verses 16 says, no man has seen or can see God. But did some people in the Old Testament, like Abraham and Moses, see God? There's a passage in Genesis 18 verse 1 that says, the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Also, a verse in Exodus chapter 33 verse 11 says, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. So is this God literally appearing, or did God take on a different form to appear? Yeah, there's many different arguments for this contradiction too. Number 7 brings us ancestral punishment. Exodus 20 verses 5 says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me. Now, another verse in the Bible found in Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 16 says, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for his own sin. Looks like a contradiction right there. We move on to number 6. Does God support lying? Proverbs 12 verses 22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. But the book of 1 Kings 22 verses 23 says, therefore, look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster against you. Halfway into number 5, how old was he? So let's take a look. In the book of 1 Kings chapter 24 verses 8, we find a passage that reads, Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. Now, a parallel passage found in the book of 2 Chronicles 36 verse 9 says, Jehoiakim was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. So was he 8 or 18? Moving on to number 4, did the sun rise or was it still dark? Mark chapter 6 verses 2 says, and very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. Now the book of John 20 verses 1 says, the first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away from the sepulchre. Okay, so we see rising of the sun, but we see in the morning while it was still dark. Rising of the sun offers a different picture than being still dark. So, contradiction or not? The contradiction at number 3 is, how did Judas lose his life? This is a pretty popular one. In the account of Matthew chapter 27 verses 5, it says, and Judas cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed, and he went and hanged himself. So we all know what hanging is, but there's another account of this in the book of Acts chapter 1 verses 18 that says, now Judas purchased a field with the reward of iniquity, and falling headlong he burst asunder in the midst, and all of his bowels gushed out. There have been some arguments saying that these verses just fall on some different semantics and language uses. It's possible to be hung and also be split open. It just really depends on what part of the hanging you're referring to. But either way, regardless of what argument is used, it still hasn't been enough to clear this up fully as being a contradiction in certain people's minds. The contradiction number 2 is by 2s or by 7s. This brings us to the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 6 verses 19. It says, and of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shall you bring into the ark. Now in the very next chapter, Genesis chapter 7 verse 2, it says, of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by two, the male and his female. So it does further explain that animals that are clean would go into the ark by sevens and the unclean ones would go into the ark by twos. But the argument made about this contradiction really is, why in Genesis 6 would it say that every living thing of all flesh, rather than just simply saying that there would be some animals going in by two? Why use the term all? Now we end off with number 1, the children of Michal. Therefore, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children unto the day of her death. And that's found in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 6 verses 23. Now in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 21 verses 8, so a little bit later on in the book, it says, "But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul." So we see the same Michal. One says that she has no sons. The other one says that she has 5 sons. Were these 5 adopted sons, maybe? Still an apparent contradiction in the eyes of many people. The first type of being is the Nephilim. So the giants or Nephilim are believed to be half angels and half man, etc. And now they were mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 verses 4, but also in different parts of the Bible as well. Now one of the popular beliefs is that Nephilim were just considered to be very large, tall people. And also many people believe that no, they were angels that actually had intercourse with humans and gave birth to this offspring, and they were big, half angel, half human type beings. Nephilim also show up in the book of Numbers chapter 13 verse 33, and it says, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Next up is the cherubim. So in the Bible, they are not these cute, cuddly winged creatures like they're sometimes represented as. The cherub, or cherubim in the plural form, are a type of heavenly creature that show up several times in the Bible. So in the book of Genesis, you see that there are 2 cherub that were sent to guard the entrance to the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were kicked out. They also appear in the book of Ezekiel as creatures with 4 wings and 4 faces. They have the face of a lion, the face of an eagle, the face of an ox, as well as the face of a human. Now ancient Israel also incorporated cherubim in the design of the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, and they're also believed to be creatures who travel very fast and very powerful, and they also help to carry the throne of God in heaven. Number 8 brings us to seraphim. Seraph is the singular, seraphim is the plural. And in the book of Isaiah chapter 6, this is the only passage in the Bible that specifically mentions the word seraph, meaning the fiery ones. Now the term also is translated as fiery serpent or fiery dragon. The prophet Isaiah describes seeing them in his vision of God in heaven. He sees God on the throne and he's surrounded by these flying angels called seraphim, and that's found in Isaiah chapter 6 verses 1 and 2. In the Bible, these creatures also have 6 wings, unlike the cherubim that have 4 wings. Now for number 7, I'm going to be grouping some of the beasts together that Daniel sees in his visions. So like the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel is made up largely of visions that are meant to symbolize real world events. And in one of these visions recorded in the book of Daniel, the prophet Daniel sees 4 creatures. Now one is like a lion with eagle's wings, one of them is a bear-like creature, and the other one looks like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and then the final one is like a dragon with iron teeth and 10 horns, and this creature goes around to destroy the whole earth. Now the creatures in this vision have been interpreted to also symbolize different world empires like the Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, as well as the Greeks and the Romans. There's a whole world of belief surrounding these creatures, but yeah, I'll probably save that for another episode. Let's move on now to number 6, where we see Behemoth. In the book of Job, one of the Bible's oldest book, this book is actually believed to be written before the book of Genesis, the Behemoth is mentioned, and it's described as a gigantic, powerful creature, and only God can put this creature under submission. His tail is so large that it's compared compared to a cedar tree, and this description led many people who believe in creation to claim that the behemoth is in fact a biblical era dinosaur. However, other beliefs is that the term behemoth just refers to a large creature. Some of those creatures may be large animals like a hippopotamus maybe. And then there's Leviathan coming in at number 5. So this is the second great monster that's described in the book of Job. Leviathan, instead of being a land animal, is a giant sea creature, and apparently this creature breathes fire as well. Leviathan can also be found in other myth stories. However, in the Bible though, Leviathan is believed to just represent large water creatures in general. And it's never specified in this Bible what creature is represented with the term Leviathan. So it's kind of leaving us wondering, was Leviathan a type of water creature that used to exist, that's extinct, or maybe it's still out there? Now let's take a look at the first beast of Revelation. So definitely the book of Revelation has a ton of creatures mentioned, but not everybody can agree whether or not these descriptions are actually literal, of future events, past events, or whatever they stand for. No biblical scholar fully agrees on what this actually means. Nevertheless, we have the term the first beast of Revelation, and it's called that because it's mentioned first, and it's a monster with 7 heads and 10 horns, and it rises up out of the ocean. And it also has the feet of a bear, the mouth of a lion, and it looks like a leopard. And depending on the theologian or the Bible scholar that has interpreted this symbol, you may get them saying that this represents the papacy or the 1st century Roman Emperor Nero, among other interpretations. And then if there's the first beast, then there's the second beast of Revelation. Now this beast rises up out of the earth, unlike the first beast that comes up out of the ocean. And now it has 2 horns and speaks like a dragon. And this beast performs false miracles that encourage people to actually go and worship the first beast, and it also allows the first beast to kill anyone who doesn't worship it. Yeah, so definitely this has been interpreted to mean various different things. Some interpreters even said that this refers to the Prophet Muhammad, and others have even said that this actually represents the United States of America. The dragon / the devil is up next, and this is another beast mentioned in Revelation, the great dragon, and he's described as having 7 heads and 10 horns, and he also has a tail that sweeps out 1/3 of the stars out of the sky. However, the disciple John, who wrote Revelation, does identify that this dragon symbolizes Satan himself, who fights against God's angels, and he's cast out into hell, and he takes 1/3 of the angels with him, and angels are represented by the stars that the dragon's tail brings down from heaven. In the Bible, the devil is also referred to as Satan, and he's depicted as an angel who once lived in heaven and rebelled against God. He got very, very prideful and was like, I'm gonna rise up, I'm gonna be the boss, I'm gonna do it better than God. And God was like, nah. And finally, number 1, we have the locusts with human faces. Okay, so I put these guys at number 1 because to me they are probably the one creature mentioned in the Bible that I'm literally praying are symbolic of something else and not actual locusts with humans' faces, because how they're described is just straight up creepy. So the passage goes like this: Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth, and they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. In appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle, and their heads were what looked like crowns of gold, and their faces were like human faces. And that's found in Revelation chapter 9 verses 3 to 10. Also, the book of Revelation talks about 10 plagues, and these locusts are given 5 months to torment people, and they'll also destroy all of the plants in sight. And I mean, they're given tails like scorpions to sting people. Yeah, really hoping that one is symbolic.